Welcome again to Theology Thursday. Today I want to tackle a subject that you may have had questions about or probably have heard about, and that is Leviticus chapter 11. Now I assume off the top of your head you go, oh yeah, Leviticus 11, I've wondered about this for a long time. You might not even know what's in Leviticus 11, but you probably do know what's there, and that is clean and unclean animals. What are called the dietary laws or restrictions that were given for the people in the Old Testament. What they were allowed to eat, those were the clean animals. What they were not allowed to eat, those are the unclean animals. So I want to take a few minutes and just quickly cover three things: what the dietary regulations were, why they were instituted, and then the issue of are we still under those today, and should we follow those requirements today. So here is a chart of the clean and unclean animals. They fall into 5 categories. Mammals, birds, reptiles, water animals, and insects. So a clean mammal had to do 2 things: have a cloven hoof, that means a hoof with like a line in the middle of it basically, and chew the cud, so they kind of regurgitate their food. The unclean animals were carnivores, animals that ate other animals, or if it was an animal that had one clean qualification. So for example, the most famous being pork. Pigs have a cloven hoof, but they do not chew the cud, and so they were considered to be unclean. They were not to be eaten at all. Unless there were just a few birds listed, pretty much all birds were open to eat. Those that are listed are birds of prey, or again scavengers. They eat dead animals off the side of the road. You can kind of see a similarity there. They were to eat no reptiles. So no lizards or snakes or anything like that. If they were a water animal, much like the mammals, they had to meet both qualifications: fins and scales. So those that didn't meet those qualifications, they were not allowed to eat. So obviously octopus and shark and all of those, catfish, because even though catfish have fins, sharks have fins, they do not have scales. So if you go to the Sea of Galilee, the most common fish they get from there is what's called St. Peter's fish, but actually it's just a kind of a form of tilapia, and it has both fins and scales. So bass, trout, any of those would be acceptable, but something lived in the water that had to have both fins and scales. So like mammals, it had to meet both of those qualifications to be considered clean. And then when it comes to insects, pretty much everything in the grasshopper family is allowed, but anything that has 4 legs and wings is not allowed. So that's kind of the chart of clean and unclean animals. So it's actually not as complicated, really not a long list, more a description of types of animals that they were allowed to eat or to not eat. That's not usually what people have a question of. They're not wondering, can I eat a rabbit? The more serious question that people have is, why? Why did God put in these dietary regulations? And actually there have been at least 6 possible answers that are given, so I'll give them to you. And then I do want to talk a little bit about what I think is what I understand it, the correct interpretation. So some believe they're arbitrary. God just wanted to test them. Would you be obedient to me or not? And so this is like a parent saying, don't go further than this in the yard. And there's no real reason for that line in the yard. Just we're testing to see if you'll obey. That does not seem to fit Leviticus 11 or really anywhere else that we would see this in the Old Testament at all. Secondly, it was religious. So some people believe that animals, and we do know that some of them, pigs and some others, were used in pagan religious practices. So essentially, this view says don't participate in pagan religious practices. And that certainly is biblical, but a number of these animals, there is no clear indication that they were used in pagan religious practices. And the reality is, goats were used in pagan religion practices, and certainly bulls were. A bull was Baal's animal, and yet they were still allowed to eat cows. So that doesn't really seem to be a legitimate way of understanding them. A third way it has been interpreted is that it was hygienic. The unclean animals carry diseases. And so that's why you don't eat scavenger animals. A fourth one is normality. This actually is a very, very popular view among many Old Testament scholars. Flying four-leggers mix animals with four legs and birds. So, for example, animals should have skin, fish should have scales. So a catfish is a mixture of fish, it has fins, and animals, it has skin. And so that's just not normal. It's weird. And so it's believed that these would be anything that was not normal. Another one, and this one is very fascinating, is that there was no firstborn. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, the clean animals are single birth animals. So a cow gives birth to a calf. I do realize that sometimes they're twins, but primarily it's an animal one at a time. Like, I mean, if you see a calf, that's the firstborn. If you see a sheep with a lamb, you knew that was their first one, and then next year they'll have another. And so when you have the unclean animals like pigs, they give a litter. So if you go out in the morning and there's a litter of piglets, you don't know which one was the firstborn, and they were under an obligation to offer the firstborn to the Lord. And so the unclean animals, you were not able to offer the firstborn to the Lord because you wouldn't know which one was the firstborn because they give litters. Now that sounds really cool, like for the mammals, but that really doesn't make sense with the fish, and so or even the insects. But it is an interesting interpretation, and you can see why some people hold to it. And then the last interpretation is that it was an act of holiness. Leviticus 11, verses 44 and 45, we get out of the end of the chapter. After God gives a description of all of these clean and unclean animals, he says, hey, you're doing this to show that you're holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. So to me, this seems to be the correct interpretation because it's the reason God gives in Leviticus 11. So when someone says, well, why don't you do that? Your answer is, well, because I belong to the Lord, and He's asked us not to do it. We don't use it as something to beat somebody over the head with. Don't use it as something for arrogance or that sort of thing. It's just, I do this because I show respect to the Lord. So in other words, the unclean animals are not somehow inherently sinful. This was just an act of holiness, an act of commitment and dedication to the Lord. By the way, you and I do this. Did you know there are no commands anywhere in the Bible that say to bow your head and close your eyes when you pray? As a matter of fact, most of the time they would stand with their eyes lifted up to heaven, and they would spread out their arms when they would pray, not kneel and fold your hands. I mean, the posture we use for prayer is actually not really found in the Bible. They would stand or kneel or lay flat on the ground. So why do we usually sit, and why do we bow our head and close our eyes? Well, we do that because we want to bow in reverence to God, and we want to close our eyes to block out distractions when we pray. If I do that in a restaurant, and someone says, what were you doing? I can say, well, I believe that everything is a gift from God, and so before we eat, we take a moment to thank God for the food that He has given us and for providing for us in life. It's not a command from God somehow as some super elaborate, or it is an act of holiness. And we have lots of these in life, things that we do that are an indication that we have set ourselves apart to God, that we have committed ourselves to Him. So I believe these were an act of holiness. It was to identify Israel as God's people. God says this is part of it. There were some other things they did. Circumcision is a perfect example. That was a sign of their devotion and dedication to the Lord. And God says, so I want you to do this as a sign that you are set apart to me. Now that leads to the third thing. By the way, let me just go back and say on that, there is probably some truth to some of the others. It is true that many of the unclean animals are really not that healthy to eat. And there may be some of the firstborn thing, but for me, the Bible says in Leviticus 11, I'm giving these commands to be holy. So to me, that seems the logical one. So the third issue is, are we as Christians under obligation to follow the dietary laws? So let me say something broader about this relationship, and then I'll get more specific here. And maybe I'll do a Theology Thursday sometime in the near future on the relationship between the Old and New Testaments and all that. So, the Old Testament has laws that are moral, that relate to all human beings. You don't murder somebody, you don't steal from them, you don't covet their possessions, you don't lie about people in court, those sort of things. Moral laws. The Bible also has some laws that were very clearly, specifically given to the nation of Israel. There are clear instructions for the king of Israel to do certain things, for the Levites to do certain things when they served in the temple. And so there were specific laws given for them, kind of ceremonial laws. Basically, I believe the New Testament teaches is that we need to consider these laws for the most part in effect unless, one, they've been fulfilled by the New Testament. So the reason we don't offer sacrifices anymore is because Jesus has fulfilled all of those sacrificial commands, all those laws related to sacrifice in His own death and resurrection. So we don't do that because Jesus has fulfilled all of those. Or sometimes the New Testament abrogates or set aside Old Testament laws and says they're not really applicable to believers, particularly to Gentile believers. And so I think that these dietary laws have been abrogated by the New Testament. In Acts chapter 10, verse 11, so it's really easy, Acts 10:11, Peter has a vision of a sheet coming down from heaven by four corners, and when it's opened up, inside are all kinds of unclean animals from Leviticus 11. And God says, eat. Peter said, I can't. I've never touched unclean food. I can't eat it. And 3 times this is repeated, and on the 3rd time, God says, do not call unclean what God has made clean. And God gives him permission to eat those foods. And so God had called it unclean in Old Testament times, the sign they were set apart to Him. Now in New Testament times, dietary regulations will not be a sign of holiness. There will be other things that are signs of holiness that we do, like the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, patience, and all that. So I think that Acts chapter 10, verse 11 doesn't tell us that God ended them or canceled them. They've just been, God says they're not applicable to Christians in the people in the New Covenant, to Christians. And so we do not have to observe those dietary laws as a sign of holiness anymore. But I do think they are instructive for us, even though we don't have to follow the specifics, because we do need to behave in ways that show that we are set apart to the Lord. In the way we conduct ourselves, particularly the way we treat other people, loving our neighbor and being gracious and be kind one to another, praying before we eat, sort of things. There are lots of things that we can do to show that we belong to the Lord. And so the dietary regulations are no longer necessary for that. So I hope that cleared up a little bit for you if you've had some questions about these clean and unclean animals and these dietary regulations. So let me just close out by saying yes, because of what we read in Acts chapter 10, it is okay for you to do in your life what I did today for lunch. That is barbecue pork. So God bless you. You have a wonderful day.